Okay, welcome. Today we are going to the Gospel of John, chapter 15, where Jesus says, I am the true vine, my Father is the vine dresser. And then a little bit later, he says, I am the vine, you are the branches. So we'll pull those slides up for you, and then we'll visit our traditional vineyard in the Holy Land. Okay, so we are in, as I said, in the Holy Land, in one of the traditional vineyards, which our tour leader Jim has been able to secure access for us. So, okay, now the vineyard that was around this watchtower is gone, but I wanted to catch the watchtower for you because it ties so nicely in with Isaiah chapter 5. My loved one had a vineyard on a fertile hillside. He dug it up and cleared it of stones and planted it with the choicest vines. He built a watchtower in it and cut out a winepress as well. And then a little bit later in Isaiah 5, the vineyard of the Lord Almighty is the nation of Israel. So, back to our little vineyard, and now let me read from Psalm 80, another Old Testament passage about the vineyard. And you are guessing already that this is the background for what Jesus says in John 15. All of the people in this audience would have been familiar with Isaiah 5, with Psalm 80, about the teaching that Israel, the people of God, is the vineyard of the Lord. So, now a few more verses along that same line from Isaiah chapter 80. You, Lord, transplanted a vine from Egypt. You drove out the nations and planted it. You cleared the ground for it, and it took root and filled the land. You cleared the ground for it. Here we are sitting in cleared ground. Let me show you what uncleared ground would look like. This is what uncleared ground looked like, very rocky. As you can see, much of the soil here has washed down into the valley. So when the vineyard owner wants to plant a vineyard, the first task is to get the rocks out as much as possible, and then go down in the valley with a bushel basket and laboriously carry the soil back, and then terrace as much as possible. It's just a very labor-intensive process. Here you can see the transition from cleared ground to not yet cleared ground. The rocks that were cleared up would be used to build the wall as a kind of a protection for the vineyard. And then you may recall, for example, that in John chapter 15, Jesus talks about the branches that don't bear fruit are cut off and then later burned. And the way that happened would be that the unfruitful branches would be cut and put on top of the wall surrounding the vineyard, creating almost a little barbed wire effect on the wall. And then later, when wintertime comes and we need some fuel to warm our house or to cook our food, those dried dead branches would be gathered and burned. The people that own this particular vineyard are aware of the fact that nowadays we put grapes on trellises, but they were kind enough to leave part of their vineyard on the ground for Jim so that he could visit this vineyard with us and talk about a traditional vineyard at the time of Jesus. So, going then to John chapter 15, being aware of that Old Testament background, let me read you a few verses from John 15. I am the true vine, and my Father is the gardener. We'll come back to that later. Every branch that bears no fruit, he cuts off and puts up on the wall. We talked about that. Every branch that does bear fruit, he prunes that it will be even more fruitful. And you can see here where some of the branches have begun to bear young grapes and then others not. And so there would be a pruning operation that takes place once those very first grapes begin to appear. The non-bearing branches are pruned so that more energy goes into the bearing branches. Remain in me as I also abide in you. No branch can bear fruit by itself. It must abide in the vine. Neither can you bear fruit unless you abide in me. If you do not remain in me, like a branch that is cut off, thrown away, and withers. Such branches are later picked up, thrown into the fire, and burned. There's also a mention about lifting. In the traditional way, if the dew lay heavy on the vines, on the ground, and a bit of mildew began to form, then they would be lifted with a rock or a piece of driftwood to get them up a little bit off the ground. Later, as I said, we developed the idea of just putting them up on trellises right away. Now, I want to go back to that very first verse of John chapter 15. I am the true vine. And I think that is in some ways the punch of this passage, and it's the part that we usually overlook. I am the true vine. Well, what's the point of contrast? The point of contrast is that on the final evening, on Thursday evening, Jesus and the 12 were in the upper room here for the Lord's Supper, or their Last Supper, and then walking past the temple up to the Mount of Olives, which is where we are sitting. In the process of walking, they would walk past the temple, very beautiful temple grounds, and you remember at one point Jesus' followers commented on that. But one of the things that was distinctive about this temple was that when Herod had completely rebuilt this, just shortly before Jesus' public ministry, he had rebuilt it with a very high quality white limestone, which was very beautiful, purple curtains, and then a gold vine that completely surrounded the entrance. And we're told that that gold vine had branches, leaves, clusters of gold grapes, and wealthy people could have their name inscribed on those branches and could donate clusters of grapes, which would then be hung up. And so everyone took great pride in this vine, which was a symbol of national Israel. And they it's a very important cultural symbol for them. Some have actually compared it to a coat of arms for the nation. Jesus looks at that and says, I am the true vine. What he's saying is that if you are plugged into the ethnic, cultural identity of this temple, you are doomed, because that temple is soon to be destroyed, and that nation is about to be scattered. See, prior to the time of Jesus, there was this very great merging of faith and culture. The faith of Abraham and Sarah and Moses and Miriam, and then traditional Old Testament Israelite culture. By the time we get down to Jesus, the faith has faded for most people, but the culture continues strong. As far as we can tell, the Sadducees really didn't care much about the faith. They simply ran this as a tourist operation. And it was a very well-known tourist attraction. From people came from around the world to see it, but the heart had gone out of it. When Jesus says, I am the true vine, he is saying he is the replacement for that ethnic system which had kind of lost its way as far as the faith. I have been in parts of the world where an ethnic culture and a faith are so intertwined that, Italian Catholic is almost one word. There are some good things about that, of course, when the culture and the faith reinforce each other. It's nice. But there are also some downsides to it. Because all too often the faith fades out and the culture continues unhindered. We saw this recently with St. Patrick's Day. Now, Patrick himself was a wonderful man, totally devoted to the Lord. He transformed the faith of Ireland, transformed the culture of Ireland. But go to the St. Patrick's Day parade in downtown Chicago this spring. Ask someone, what's St. Patrick's Day all about? Will you hear about the faith? No, you'll hear about the green beer. Because the faith has faded and the culture just keeps right on going. It's somewhat what had happened in Jesus' day. There were a few godly people, of course, Anna, Simeon, Zechariah, Elizabeth, but for many the faith had faded and the culture just kept right on going. And Jesus says, I am the true vine. If you are plugged into your ethnic identity or your denominational identity for your spiritual sustenance, you get to unplug from that and plug into me. I am the true vine. You are the branches. So, thank you for joining us. Have a great spring break, and we'll see you again later.